And as I look out the window, it's a snowy day developing over the mountains. They're sort of misty. I have the time to relate a little story that I've talked about in the past, and now I am going to get into it as far as I can. This will be for the Dallies, the Downers, and the Schropes to start with. A bit of this area is when they were grandparents, grandfolks, and people of my own age. I feel that if I do not get this down on tape, there isn't anybody else that remembers or is around to remember what I saw when I was around the ages of 5, 6, 7, 8 in that general category. So we'll get started with the Dallies, rather brief, but it's their history. My great-grandfather's name was Charles C. Dally, and he was born on the July of 1943, and he died in April of 13th of 1926. His wife was Isabel Tuttle, who lived about the same length of time. I remember both were quite elderly when I saw them last in Harrison, New Jersey, on Jersey Street. It was located. In this time period, my great-grandfather Charles was in the United States Army and had been in the ranks for quite a time, and at the time of his retirement in Company K, and was also in the 7th Regiment as captain. He was mustered out on the 10th of March in 1865. That would be at the end of the Civil War. But he was in it and very active throughout the whole period. Information is that he spent a lot of time in Virginia, in that general area, but also into Pennsylvania. The marriage produced several children, and one was Theodore A. Dally, who was my grandfather, and he was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. There is no details as to what he did, but we do have his picture in the gallery here in Vermont. He was married to Jenny Thompson, a person who came from County Cork, Ireland, as I have been told, and she was a happy, laughy person, and unfortunately she died of cancer at a rather early age in the marriage. This marriage, there were 3 children. My father, Theodore B. Dally, and there was Mabel Dally, and the younger Harold Dally. So just lived down the street from Charles Dally's home, and so it was a very close relationship in those years. Records show that Samuel Dally came to this country in 1635 from England and lived on a plantation in Jamestown, Virginia. Went by, the Dalleys ended up in Woodbridge, New Jersey, and said to me that they established the clay industry in the state of New Jersey. They also were apparently good Presbyterians, and there was a Presbyterian church just down the block from their home in Woodbridge, and it was called the Presbyterian Church in the Round because it was around most of the church area that cars could come down, swing around the building, and go in another direction, but it was in the round. So that's how the church got its name, and that particular building no longer exists at this time. And for whatever reason, they moved from Woodbridge to Harrison, New Jersey, Jersey Street. They had a nice single-family home, but no grounds to speak of. That's the way the whole street and area was established, was very narrow properties. But it was a rather spacious home with a comfortable living room, a nice big dining room, and then beyond that a kitchen, which was also quite spacious for those days. And I don't recall anything about the second floor, but I would assume there were at least 4 bedrooms at that point. Charles and Isabel lived there until their death, and then their daughter took over the house and stayed there during her lifetime, and then the house was passed on to her daughter. I don't doubt that any of them are living at this point, and I don't know who owns the house or what its condition is. I imagine Charles lived on with income from his many years in the service, and my grandfather, Dalley, worked for Mazda Lamp Works in Harrison. We will talk about my father at a later date. That is his job, business. The next history that I will touch on is that of the Downer family. And the earliest that I can back, I never saw him, but that was Benjamin Newkirk Downer, who was born in 1837. He married Emily Matilda Vesey, and that was and she was born in 1840. England, New Jersey. And was the person that was in the same sort of business that I ended up in, steamshipping. He was a superintendent for the Grace Lines and spent many years there until a stroke made it impossible for him to work any longer. And I understand he was a real good dresser and demanded a lot of respect, and I'm sure the Grace Line looked after him for all the years of his life at home due to the stroke. Vesey sounds sort of French, but she did come from England, and she did as I remember it, love her tea. She was a short, very small person and was always in charge, but very pleasant about it. She ran the house. Located at 10 Mitchell Place in East Orange. I don't believe the building exists any longer, along with many others that I think were taken down. Part of the story is that her father established a pharmacy at the corner of Vesey Street and Church Street in New York City, and the street was named after them. It would be in the period around the 1830s, 1840s in that, and the Vesey's, the word could be spelt like Vessey or Vsey, and then New York language says Vesey Street, but it's Vesey Street. But anyhow, we'll get on to the church here in just a second. One of these Vesseys, it is stated, became the first rector at Trinity Church, a rather famous old church downtown New York. And also there were other streets in the vicinities that were related to this family, he being the rector of the church. Apparently very popular. My grandmother Schroep's maiden name was Marion Matilda Downer. Born in 1865. She was married to Edwin Lee Schroep, who was born in 1866. Marion Matilda Downer was from the marriage of Benjamin Newkirk and Emily Matilda Vesey. Now you have the coming together of two families. Marion Matilda Schroep, married to Edwin Lee Schroep, and Matilda, no, it's Marion Downer. You have my mother, Edith Downer Dowley, Amy Schroep, my mother's sister, and Edgar, my cousins. My second cousin, Arthur, known as Artie Downer, the youngest brother to my grandmother, Marion, was Arthur. And Arthur was the father of whom we call Artie Downer, and living in Westfield, New Jersey. Just wanted to get that in so you know where Artie fitted in. He would be a second cousin to me, or vis-a-vis. Now we come to the Schroeps, and I mentioned before George B. Schroep was married to He was born in 1842, and he married Amy E. Robbins, and she was born in 18... Insert, the mahogany cabinet that we keep our dishes in the downstairs hall has the name Amy on it on the inside, and that was her cabinet, which we remember. She was my great-grandmother, Amy, and she did move from Flemington and lived with her son, Edward Lee Schroep, in Irvington on Grove Street. She had the second floor of this two-family house, and she stayed there until she passed away, her husband having died earlier. And she was a very nice lady, kind of quiet, and but, well, she was another great-grandparent. From that marriage between Edwin and From the marriage of Edwin and Marion Schroep, we had my mother come along, as stated, Amy and Edgar. In those days, Irvington was not a bad place to live. Had good transportation with the trolley cars to in and out of Newark and up to Maplewood. And they had a couple of movies there, and it was a good place to go to enjoy a Saturday afternoon when you were a kid. Maybe if you had a date, go out to the movie in the evening on Saturday night. My grandparents lived at that address until their death, and they seemed a very happy couple. They were all very nice to me, all my great-grandfolks, and I guess I was fortunate to have been around early enough to have spent just a few years with them before they all passed on, but that's the way things go. And so I guess I was only around 5 to 8 years old when I got to know them all fairly well, those that were still about. Who was around when I first met them all? Well, there was my great-grandmother Downer, there was my great-grandmother Schroep, and it was my great-grandfather Dally and great-grandmother Dally, and that was it. Any of you interested in family history, we have a copy of the Dally family history. It's not extensive, but it gives you the general idea of things. Somebody ought to really spend a little time looking that one up. The Schroeps and the Downers are well covered in a heavy book that was given to me by Edgar, and you can get a lot of stories, and there are many other families mentioned in that booklet, and I would suggest that you pass it from one of you to the other so you can just read about the family, the Schroeps, the Downers, and there's some pictures and things of interest that would be very nice to have you all understand and know something of the background of the family. I have to add in here, there's one thing that I forgot, and that is there was a Benjamin Newkirk Downer and he was the Reverend Benjamin Downer in Westfield, New Jersey, and officiated at the Presbyterian Church, which is so prominent in Westfield. And he died at the pulpit on a Sunday morning, the date being 5/31, 1968. For the record, the shrubs are all pretty well buried up in Prospect Hill Cemetery in Flemington, New Jersey, if you care to look into their history to the final. Then the Downers are mostly all buried at the cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey. The Dalleys are buried mostly at Woodbridge, New Jersey, and of course the Quarters and Mom and I and whoever else cares to will be buried at the Hollywood Cemetery in Union, New Jersey. Just so you know where everybody has ended up, and perhaps will. I will now start with the David B. and Martha A. Quarter lifestyle as I can best recall. The Quarters were in no way related to the Dalleys. Both of these families became very closely aligned, as you will find out. Mr. Quarter was born in 1845 and passed away in 1935. Mrs. Quarter was born 10 years later than Mr. Quarter and died 1 year later than he did in 1935. He was 90 and she was 80. The Quarters for all the time together had no issue, and I might say that he did have brothers and sisters. One was John Quarter, the other was William Quarter, the other was Charles Quarter. There was a sister, Jane Quarter, and a half-sister, Joanna Crowell. I do not want to know just where all this family disappeared to, but I know that Jane Quarter is buried in the Hollywood Cemetery, not in the David Quarter gravesite, but another one under another person's name. Not married. Joanna resided in a nice home on Valley Street, opposite almost the Pearson Mill. I believe some of her family are still residing in Maplewood. Joanna had a daughter by the name of Lottie Crowell. No, what became of her? No doubt the Crow family could tell us. The Quarter was born in Maplewood. That was on Lincoln's birthday, February 12th. He bought the farm known as the Quarter Farm from his grandfather, and he worked for his grandfather very hard in the fields and to grow corn and all the crops necessary for a dairy farm, and also to be able to eat. And he eventually bought this farm from his grandfather and established his own way of life. Mrs. Quarter's maiden name was Van Houten, and she was born in Union, New Jersey. She also was very wound in with a family that very prominent in Union many years ago by the name of Headley. So she used the name Martha Headley quite often. And also she had a brother in Union by the name of Van Houten, and she would visit there occasionally. But I think she was tied in with the Headleys more than anything. And in the section of Union known as Peanut Town, the intersection of Vauxhall Road and Burnett Avenue, owned by people known as Miller, and it was Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Corder that were like sisters, and maybe they were, that I don't know, but they were very close, family close. How that area of Union became known as Peanut Town, I have no way of knowing. Maybe they grew peanuts, I don't know, or ate them. When we went to visit there, my father and mother had a Model T Ford, and it would be in the winter time, so they had curtains that you could hang on the sides of the doors on Model Ts to keep the rain out or the cold. And all those roads were nothing but mud roads. And it was quite a thrill to get through them and get to hard pavement again. Not too far, maybe within a half a mile, was a freight railroad called the Rahway Valley Railroad. It ran from what would be around about 22 all the way up to Maplewood, right close to Springfield Avenue in the Hilton section of Maplewood. That was there through the war, of the Second War, and brought up coal and whatever other freight that was designated for that area. And that steam engine used to puff and smoke, and sometimes if it had a heavy road, you could hear the wheels skidding on the tracks, trying to maintain traction. Later on, they got rid of the steam locomotive and bought a diesel, which handled all the freight that they had very adequately. I think the southern terminus of this was down in Roselle, tied in with the B&O railroad that went through Roselle. If you look at the picture over our mantle, you will see the farm and the farmhouse and a gentleman running through the field there. That might have been my father, for all I know. He never claimed so. And then across the street you'll see a house, and that was known as the Stone House, and it was leased out. There's also a spring there and a spring house, and there after the milk was obtained from the cattle, the big canisters were taken over to the spring house for cooling. It was quite a running steam, and so set up that most of the coldness of it was taken out by the time it left the spring house. It brings us to the purpose of the farm and the growth of whatever was there. Mr. Corder used to get up at 4 in the morning, get the milk into the wagon. He had a team of horses, and he would drive to Newark, which was 5 miles to the east of Maplewood, and 15 miles to go to New York. His outlet for customers was in North Newark and Harrison. And that, I believe, is where he came in contact with the Dalleys, because that's where his delivery area was. And so he got to know the Charles Dalley family and also the Theodore A. family. And there, I guess, he laid eyes on my father, Theodore P. Dalley, at an early age. The arrangements were with regard to my father. He ended up on the farm as a very young man, a young boy. And there he remained for, really, in that area the rest of his life. I assume that he was given chores to do, and no doubt he did them, but perhaps not happily at times. Mr. Corder had two hired hands at the farm to help out with the workload of milking and the cattle and whatever cultivating that was necessary. And I guess the load was heavier in the summer when there was all the gathering than at other times. And I know Mrs. Corder, she had a tame crow, and it would stay around the house, and she used to get very upset because she'd put the wash out to dry, and that's the way you did it in those days. And the crow would come in and pull out the clothespins, and the wash would drop to the ground. So I remember that story. The White Farmhouse is rather interesting in some aspects. It's so old. The beams holding the house up underneath, the cross beams, were all hand-hewed, and I've seen them many years ago. But that's the way they are, and I'm sure nobody's touched them. The part that is flat is where the kitchen was, and that still can be seen, although maybe it's hard to believe, but it was moved up to two houses to the east of the farm and attached to the back as a kitchen. And this is a very nice home, but that's where the kitchen walked to. A porch was added to the front of the house, and it shaped up very nicely. Directly across the street and next to the stone house is where my father and mother obtained enough money from Mr. Corder to put up the existing house. And my two sisters, Jean and Marion, and myself first, were all born up in the front room of the house, second floor front room. So that's how it all got started, of the expanding Dalley family. Mr. Corder sold the farm in the early 1900s, say about 1902, 3, somewhere in there, and had a house built at 16 Oberlin Street, and where he did eventually retire for the rest of his life. Source of income was, as I understand it, 18 mortgages, all at 6%, due and payable at his house. It's a very tall house and has a porch across the front and down one side, the westerly side. You enter the house, you go through two outside doors and then a nice oak door, and then a large hallway reception area with a beautiful oak stairway going up on the left-hand side as you enter to the second floor. There's a landing partially the way up. To the right of the entry hall is a nice large living room with a fireplace. Never got used because they had a gas stove put in. Then the rooms are separated by rolling oak doors, which no longer are there. For what reason, I don't know. And then you went into a large living room, dining room, not living room, storage for glasses and cups and whatever. And on the right-hand side, there was a series of 3 windows and an area where you could put 2 chairs and comfortable chairs, and you could look out the windows and see what's going on with traffic going up and down Oberlin Street. And this was where they both spent many, many months and years during the day. They started at 6 in the morning, even in their late years. Breakfast at 7. Large midday dinner, and in the evening at 5 o'clock, a light supper, and to bed at 9. The second floor had 4 bedrooms, and one had an access to the railed-in front porch on off the second floor. The house was built so high that the attic could have been roomed as well as the second floor, and you would still have an attic above it. But this has never been done. But you did get a good view from the windows of the attic looking west, as you could see a great deal of Maplewood and the Orange Mountain beyond. It was rather interesting. And then downstairs you had you left the dining room while you went through a butler's pantry, and there was all kinds of room there for dishes and platters and all the things that are needed, particularly at holiday time. And there was also the coffee bean grinder, which got worked every morning, and always good fresh coffee in the house. They used to keep the coffee up in the attic in a milk container so it would not aerate, and also there was storage there of sugar. Two came up by horse and wagon from a warehouse in Newark called Cussey's, and it was down in the Jewish section, Prince Street area of Newark. There were all kinds of people taking wagons of different foods and so on, and rolling those wagons around the Newark to their customers. There weren't too many stores in those days like you do today. The rear of the house, there was a barn, and that was as big as a house. In that, on one side, there was a big roller door, and in that area were stored the buggy, the carriage, tasseled, and a working wagon, one that could carry freight and so forth. Across from that, in a separate area, were a stall for 3 horses. I never saw any horses there, but it was there. There was a pork share attached to the house where people coming with horses could hitch up their horses to the wall. There was a ring there for that, and you could get in and out of the carriage without getting wet. So there were all these facilities. The front stretch of their property was 150 feet, and the depth was 150 feet. Big for Maplewood. Along the street, you had a flagstone walkway, and this was fine until the roots of the trees got underneath them and raised them, and then you could really trip yourself. So you had to be careful with these. They were later replaced with cement, but took time. And of course, this was done when there were curbs put in also. They had a hedge that went up on either side of the property and then across the back to the barn. And it became my job later on to cut this hedge. And I've never touched a hedge since. It gave me hay fever from the dust and the oil in the leaves of the hedge. And it was a rough job because I had to stand on one side and cut as much as I could and then go on the other side and finish up the job. So it was, I got paid for it, but not very much, I don't think. Not by today's standards, anyhow. Another job that I grew into was to push a reeled lawnmower and cut all that grass. So there was 50 by 150 on one side. The house was left to me on their desks. That was a job that I grew into, believe me. But I was a pretty lucky guy because Mr. Corder was a great man, and Mrs. Corder was too. And they did love me. There's no question about it. And I loved them. And that was the important thing. I spent a lot of time with them when I was young, and used to love to go up there. I was always invited to have a meal with them, and they were always good meals too. And when later on Mrs. Oviatt was the housekeeper, she was a good cook too, and she was a hard, conscientious worker. One thing I never liked was when the Corters went to Florida, and they did that for 35 years in a row. And they would leave on the first Sunday of December and return on the first Sunday in March. This was not a long time for Florida, but it seemed long to me. And so they were never there for Christmas, but of course they always left gifts for Christmas and sent up crates of fruit, oranges and grapefruit and tangerines. They would have someone drive them down to, I think it was Mr. Gardner. He had a open roadster type car. And he would take us down to the Pennsylvania station in Newark, and the suitcases and all were taken up to the platform. And I remember these tremendous steam engines coming in from New York through to Newark with an elevated station, not the one that's there now. And they would see the engineer there he'd have glasses on and he'd have his hat on backwards, and he looked very important and very much in charge. So it was a Pullman train, and so it had compartments where you could have your own room and privacy. And then, of course, they had the parlor car and also the observation car. Can't think of it. Just Washington, where it turned over to another rail line, and then it became Atlantic Coastline, which took you right into the St. Petersburg, Florida railroad station. And then it was just a matter of a couple of blocks to the Fifth Avenue Hotel, where they went every year, pretty much. So it was, I think that building, I saw it here a couple of years ago. Not sure, but it seems like it would have been the Fifth Avenue Hotel, as I remember some pictures that the quarters had taken. And when they came back, generally there wasn't any snow left in Maplewood. It was pretty clear. And so a week before they came home, why, Brock and Murray, their plumber, would come up from Irvington, New Jersey, and they'd get the pipes put back together, and a fire would get put in to start to warm the house, get the dampness out so that it was comfortable when the quarters came back. Then, of course, was the going down on that Sunday, very joyful and happy. And usually about a dozen chickens. Plymouth Rock were the popular ones, although there were some Rhode Island Reds, but not many. And then the yard for them to move around in went beyond this, and then at the very end there was a grape arbor, which came up to about the height of a man, and then extended out over part of the chicken roaming area, and this made it handy to collect the purple type grapes, and these would be harvested in the latter part of September, when there was just maybe a slight touch of frost, which helped sweeten the grapes. These were picked by Mr. Corder and taken in, and then there was a whole set of pots and so on that each year these grapes would be cooked up. And one of the things that was always good was good grape juice. Another thing was grape jelly, and then also grape marmalade. And these were all took about 3 or 4 days to do the whole thing, and then all of this would be taken down in the basement and stored away on the shelves so that they were available as one needed them. And quite often the grape juice was brought up to be given to the guests that arrived, and they always complimented how good they were. In back of the barn, in others' property, there was a big, tremendous field, and I used to like to go out there and with a kite and get it started, and then lie down in the grass and watch it swish back and forth. And this was also an area where there were a lot of pheasant, and by golly, I used to get scared every so often. I'd practically step on one and it would take off in fright, but I was the more frightened one. I practically went into shock sometimes. There were some stretches of brush growing, and my sister Marion and I used to go up there and pick what's called bayberries, and we'd bring them down to the house, and they were sold for 25 cents a bundle. And so we did make a little extra money, and we always had people that were interested in having them, and of course they made a nice winter spacious looking set of things that at one time had been alive, but they had nice little berries, and people enjoyed having them in their house. Next to the quarters on the easterly side, or toward Tuscan Road, there was a property of about 75 feet in width, 150 feet deep. And I remember Mr. Corder taking me over there, and there the horses were there, and the plow and the shovels. And so the basement was dug there for the new house to go up. So happens that these people that did this, or built it, were named Hinder, very German and very private people. He loved gardening and had a great garden there, and he used to get cow manure in and have it placed back toward the field, and also he would throw corn out there, and sometimes when I'd walk up to the quarters for breakfast around 7, why, it wasn't uncommon to see a couple of dozen pheasants out there enjoying the corn. This house later was bought by Mom's father and mother, and they moved in, and then of course I guess you know pretty much the rest from that time, about maybe 10 years later, when I first met her as a neighbor. I usually managed to get to know everybody in the neighborhood. There was people by the name of Schill, Rosencrantz, McCullen, Smith, Knott, Van Ness, Zimmerman, Brandt, and there are a few others that I can't recall their name, but I knew everybody pretty much on the street. Well, I spent a lot of time in that area, and speaking of knowing people, my job on Saturday mornings generally was to go to the butcher store and get the meat for the weekend. So I'd have my list that my mother would give me, and I had to be over at the butcher's certainly by 7:30, or there'd be a big line ahead of me, and I'd spend half the morning waiting to be waited on, because Mr. Eberhardt, the butcher, was talked a lot and cut all his meat so that nothing was pre-packaged or anything. We never heard anything like that. And down at the other end, near the door, his wife, Mrs. Eberhardt, would sit and collect the money, and he would tell her how much it was, and if she thought it wasn't enough, why, she'd yell at him. So there was a bit of comedy going on. And then another thing that always smelled so good was the barrel of sauerkraut that they had in the one side of the store. So if you wanted country ribs, then you would certainly have your pail for the sauerkraut. You had to bring your own pail because they had nothing to give you to carry it in. So when I get out of there, I used to go on up to right near Prospect and Springfield Avenue, and there was a store there called National, and all they did was sell packaged or canned goods, and with the exception that they had two big tubs, one for butter and one for American cheese. And so he would cut this to, say you wanted a pound, he'd cut about approximately a pound, and then he had a scale right there, and he'd put it on and then in a paper type container, and you'd bring it home. But he would go around and pick out the things that you asked for from the shelves, bring them back to the counter. Then he had a big brown paper roll there, and he'd rip off what he thought was necessary, and he'd lay that out, and then on that he would have the price of everything that you had requested. And he added up and tell you what it was, and then he'd wrap it up with a lot of string and put a handle on it so you could carry it. Of course, I had a wagon, so I could set that in the wagon and didn't really need the handle. But anyhow, that was the way things were done. And I can't imagine how anything could be done like that today, unless you really went up into the upper parts of Vermont at one of the country stores, and then you'd be all right. But certainly not down in the cities of New Jersey or elsewhere. The thing that they had was ice cream stores, and Maplewood, as I remember, it had three. There was Struby, there was Cleese, and there was Manjuri's. And Manjuri's was really set up like a Spanish building, and they all had good ice cream, and it was easy to go in, and it didn't cost much, and so you could even go in. I used to go in and get a malted milk every once in a while, so that was good. And another thing right across from that was Manjuri's. There was a barber shop, so you go in there to get your hair cut about once every 3 weeks. And then at that time, why, there was a fellow there, the colored fellow, and he was a shoe shine man, and so I used to have some pretty sparkly shoes as I got into high school, where I thought it was important, and also to look good for church. And it was, you know, a quarter did it. Now I don't know what you'd pay. It wouldn't be a quarter. Back to when I was maybe in the range of 5 to 10 years old, somewhere in that, we used to get some pretty good snowstorms, and very few people had cars, and so there were no plows to plow the roads. So if you took your car out in the snow, why, you just hoped you could make it. Some people did, but not many people took their cars out. Most people put them away for the winter. And due to the fact that none of the roads were being plowed. However, they did have horses pulling like a flat-bottomed rowboat, and they would go along where the sidewalks were and plow them. So you could walk along. You wouldn't quite go to the paved cement or flagstone, but you know, you weren't walking in snow over your ankles. So that was one thing. And the other thing was rather fascinating, because the horses generally were pulling wagons. But I remember Borden's, Albany, Becker, all of them had sleighs pulled by a team of horses, and the milk and whatever else they were selling would be there, and they would just go along and make their deliveries. I remember also there was a fellow by the name of Bischoff. He lived in Maplewood, and ultimately had a store down near where Columbia High School is, on Valley Street. But he would come up to the quarters with his horse and wagon, and they would go out, the quarters would go out and look at whatever meat that he had and what they wanted, and then he'd cut the meat to the size they wanted and the type of what it was. But that was another type of delivery at that time. You didn't just have to go to a meat store. You did have, in this case, somebody delivering it. There was another one, eggs and butter. That was Flint. And they used to come around with horse and wagon, make their deliveries. So it was just the beginning of letting the horses still go, but terminating potentially. And the transportation into Newark was by trolley, and anybody going to Newark in that area would take the trolley. If you lived down by the center of town, why, you'd take the Valley Street trolley, which would take you to South Orange and then on into Newark. And so it was, that's the way you did it. And then, of course, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad ran through Maplewood, and anybody working in New York or who would take that, it was steam engine, and they had a good service, and everybody depended upon it. And of course, the nice part of it is when you got to Hoboken, you did have a choice of subway, and which later became known as, that was the Hudson Tubes, but then they changed it later to PATH, and now I think it's New Jersey Transit Authority that owns it. If not, it's got to be the Port Authority. But anyhow, they had, Lackawanna had ferry boat service. One service went to downtown New York. As I recall, it was Barclay Street. And then directly across was the Christopher Street ferry. And they had, two of the boats had paddle wheels. I think one was the Orange, and the other one could be Maplewood, but I'm not sure about the latter. I used to take that across, and when I got over to New York, then I'd walk over to Greenwich Village, where NYU was located, the School of Commerce, and that was on what is known as Washington Square. And then at the northerly end of that was the big arch, beginning of Fifth Avenue. The third service was called the 23rd Street ferry, and that would take you up to where a lot of the passenger ships of the day used to come in. Called those piers were called the Chelsea piers, and I think that whole area is still known as Chelsea. But anyhow, all the big liners went there. And I used to enjoy going through on the ferry boat to Christopher Street, because I'd be going across about the time a lot of these ships would be coming up. So I got to know them all pretty well, seeing them for about 4 years of going back and forth to school. I think the rather unique thing about Maplewood is that it's not an industrial town, but is a residential town. So you had the small shops for groceries, vegetables, drugstore, ice cream, shoe store, all the necessity stores for everyday living. And they were all down in the village, and the village is really right in the center of the town, right by the railroad tracks, and it's just odd that it's there, because you go through streets with nothing but homes from the east, and the same from the west. They're all, it's there, but you just don't expect it. And there's no indication that it is there until you go under the railroad tracks on Baker Street and come into the town. And that was called, the main street was called Maplewood Avenue. The other area that developed, but very gradually, was along Springfield Avenue. There was plenty of land along there, and the ones that did come in didn't take up much land, but they gradually filled in over the years until it's become what it is now, small business area. One of the famous persons in town was a man by the name of Rickleton, and he had a home on Valley Street, and he was one who went to Africa and brought home animals that he had stuffed and preserved. And he had one big room with a lot of shelves that these animals could be placed so that you could come in and see all the things that he had been involved in. And he had quite a few pictures of his trip. He was a photographer as well. Well, anyhow, that was on Valley Street, and that was there for many, many years. I don't know anything about its status now. In fact, I haven't even thought about it until now. Just going through my head. He was famous enough that the grade school, now called Maplewood Junior High, was called the Rickleton School, and its range was K through 8. And then you went to Columbia High School over in South Orange. Maplewood and South Orange had a joint school system, and they ended up with what we know as Columbia High School, which was built and opened in 1926 on Parker Avenue, which this cost about $1.2 million, and had two gymnasiums, one for boys, one for girls, and also a swimming pool, all of which exists today. Well, to get on with my father, Theodore B., went through the school system at Rickleton and then went on to Columbia and South Orange, and I believe that he graduated from Columbia about 1910, somewhere right around there. And I went to the Rickleton School, K through 8, but we only went to the 3rd grade, and at that time they had 2 schools come online. One, the Tuscan School in the general vicinity of my folks' home. This was on the right close to Tuscan School and Prospect Street, and was named after and known as Tuscan School. The other one was the Jefferson School, which was on Ridgewood Road. This was a very pretty school, all stone exterior. Tuscan School was more conventional, but still, they both had the same facilities. So I started in Tuscan School in the 4th grade and went through the 6th, and then went to Maplewood Junior High, and then graduated the 8th grade, and we went over to Columbia. No, I have it wrong. We went to the 9th grade and started the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. That's what we did. It was a 3-year high school. And when we were there, we met the kids coming over from South Orange, and so we got to know a lot of people in both towns, and the relationship has always been good, and I assume it still is. Maplewood also had a police department, and I remember they had a Harley Davidson there at that time. I don't think they had an Indian. I don't recall that motorcycle. And then they had a couple of motorcycles with sidecars. And so they could sometimes, where somebody would have to be taking a policeman to maybe home or maybe to wherever he was going to be working. They also had early beginning a Model T, and then they went to the Model A, and then of course as time went by, they continued to upgrade. The fire department was always a paid fire department, and Maplewood only bought America La Francis, and I remember those engines. They had great squawk boxes when they were not sirens, but squawk boxes, and they made a terrific racket, and they had the firehouse down on Donnell Road, opposite one end of the park, Memorial Park, and as I recall, it was a four-door firehouse with upstairs offices, and they had two engines for regular duty. They had one older one spare in case of a problem, and then they had the hook and ladder. And they covered the town west of the Lackawanna Railroad and east of the Lackawanna Railroad up to Prospect Street. There was also another engine house in Hilton, and there was only the one pumper there, but if there was a fire over there, it was a good location for them to be, and they'd be there first. But they also would send one pumper and the hook and ladder from Maplewood firehouse, so they had adequate equipment and personnel, and everybody was pretty proud of that department. The form of government in Maplewood was township type of service, and it was a 5-man township committee, and they were very conservative, and so when the fire department was moved from Maplewood Center, then that was made into police headquarters, and there had been a school right next to it in the center of town, and that was turned over and made into township business office. The clerks and whoever else was necessary to operate the town from day to day. Later on, these two spots were abandoned. One to the present where the firehouse is now, and then they put up a beautiful new municipal building on Valley Street opposite the park, and that's still there today and will be there for many, many more years because it's a beautiful structure. So they made do until they felt it was the right time to move, and then they did it with the will of the people, and they very seldom were given a bad time. Incidentally, Maplewood has the oldest civic association in the state of New Jersey, and that was true when I used to live there back in the early 50s. I was actively interested in the goings-on at the town level of the government. As far as churches go, there was the Hilton Methodist Church in Hilton. There was also a not too active Baptist church there on Burnett Avenue. And then you had the Prospect Presbyterian Church, and then there was the Methodist Church in the other side of the town, and also St. George's Episcopal Church. There was also St. John's over in Hilton. Came in a little later, but became a very active and prominent church in the community, and still is. So all of these churches served the population, and they were well attended at that time, and people did get to church on Sunday in those days. After Mr. Corder had sold the farm, and that's, as I say, around 1902-4, we had his farm all developed. It was a 150-acre farm. Streets were put in, and one of them is known as Corder Avenue. That's the one that's closest, paralleling Tuscan Road. And there were 3 other roads that were put in like steps, one after the other. And then all the immediate streets like Oberlin, Yale, and Harvard, and then when these were filled out, well, then they started to go up to where I used to fly my kite. And there were about 5 more roads put in, paralleling each other. And house after house was built. So that by 1930, Maplewood's population had reached about 25,000 people. So it was a fast-growing town, but all residential, and more expensive homes were on the hill on the westerly side of the town. But there were also very nice homes in around where the Corters lived, and Hilton had nice homes too, but the least expensive, and this is where you were more apt to find the blue-collar worker or men similar in positions, maybe just beyond blue-collar. But anyhow, it was a good, solid town, and the way they operated it was very efficient. I never cared for the grade schools. I just never got with it. To be happy about being there was always a duty. I ended up going to some summer schools to catch up with some of the courses that I had. I still don't know whether they did much good, but I was promoted. And but when I got to high school, I really started to enjoy it, and met a lot of people. My studies came easier, and I didn't mind. I was involved in track, running the mile after school, and so I met a lot of good guys that way. And I always enjoyed going to the football games. Columbia always had a pretty good team. I didn't play in it. I wasn't heavy enough for that, and maybe not even the spirit for it, but I always enjoyed being there. We also had a great group of friends, I think we went, there was one group that I was in, there must have been about 20 of us, and we would go down on Saturday night to the women's club just off in from Maplewood Center, and for $2 you could dance from 8 to 12. They had a live band there, and everybody dressed up. You wore, I even got so far as to wear tails for a while, and but there was no drinking or anything like that. You came in, you were supervised carefully by parents, and we had a great time dancing and just kind of being there. And the girls all got dressed up with nice, very formal dresses, and this was the outing to show off how nicely you dressed and how well you behaved. And we would be able to have some punch to wet our whistles, and we rotated around. One week I'd take one girl, and then 2 weeks later another girl, and or you'd buy them corsage and have it sent by the florist, or you couldn't do that, you took it with you. And so the parents would have to pick you up and take you, and then pick you up at 12 o'clock when the whistle blew, and get you home. And if you knew somebody that had a driver's license, you might be able to go to one of the ice cream places and have ice cream, whatever, soda. And there was one diner on Springfield Avenue known as Todd's, Todds, and get good hamburgers there. And if you wanted to go a little different way than usual, but that was a great time we had, and I'll never forget it because I just enjoyed it. Seemed things went along pretty good, so I was happy about that. I might want to tell you that the fellows that I met was like Augie Baldwin, now known as Sam Baldwin, Horace Van Dorn, Howard Markuson, a fellow by the name of Klemp, and Hurd. And Augie and Van were the ones that I guess I met in the 2nd or 3rd grade. And, well, I still know them today, 1999. Across the street from me, my folks' house, in the old quarter house, were people by the name of Ernest Hopkinson, and they had a very nice family. There was Dorothy, Alice, and Janet, who passed away as a young girl, and then Mary. And Mary and I were only a week apart in age, so we really grew up, and she was like, it was like brother and sister. And of course there are pictures of that going way back. And she got married and became Mrs. Heyer, and she had a son and a daughter. And then, well, she and her husband have passed away several years ago, the way of all flesh. And so we miss her, but right up to the end we saw her within a couple of weeks of the time she passed away. And she was staying at a rest home with condos in South Jersey near Toms River. Well, there was another one, Bob Smith, and he was a good guy too, and got to know him way back in grade school. Another fellow that I knew quite well and traveled with and socialized with was Jack Dietz. And his father was a ship and oil broker. And when we finished up high school in June, graduated, why, we were allowed to get on a tanker that was going through the Panama Canal and on up to San Pedro, which is the port for Los Angeles. And went out in an empty ship and loaded 83,000 gallons of naphtha. And they were expecting a strike, so they put on a couple of hoses to fill the ship up and get it out before the strike took place. So instead of having about a week of enjoying the area of L.A., why, we were hustled off, and that spoiled a lot of things because there was entertainment set up for us and opportunity to meet some of the girls and go dancing and prancing. However, we started back, but the thing that was very nice was the transit of the canal. It's a wonderful experience, and the captain also took us ashore before we went through the canal going west, and we went to, I think it was the Panama Hotel, but it was one of those tropical type hotels, you know, with big veranda and then screened in porches and painted white and quite large and so on. So we had our meal there while the ship was going through the canal, and then we got on a railroad and went over by rail and met the ship and then headed to San Pedro. But coming back, we stayed on the ship and enjoyed all the going through the locks and seeing how everything worked. And well, I enjoyed the trip so much that the following year, I took a postgraduate course along with about 81 others because there was no money enough to send all of us to college. And those were hard times. That was in 1933 when I graduated in June. So in 1934, after I had finished my postgraduate year, I had made up my mind what I was going to do and didn't have much way of knowing where to go to work because there wasn't that much work. So I went on the ship and we got $49.50 for a month's work. And you put in an 8-hour day and the usual sea shifts. And so I got on the ship at Warren, New Jersey, and we headed down to Houston, and so that was very interesting, going up the Houston Canal and then turning around and then docking at the Shell's refinery there. And when we loaded up, why, off we went into Wilmington, North Carolina one time, Baltimore was another time, back to Sewaren, and then that finished my time. But in the meantime, I had gotten quite interested in, with the help of the captain, why, you know, we got out charts, and he said, well, all right, we're going to enter into this bay, and there's this tide, and there's these lights, and so on, and navigate the ship up there. Well, I almost decided to stay and put in my time and work toward getting a third mate's license. But that all changed when I got to know your mother, better. Your mom was 15 and I was 17 when I got to notice her. And while I was out on the ship, why, she would write me letters and I would write her letters. And so a good, pleasant relationship. And then I decided that, seeing as I knew her so much, that I would prefer to go to NYU and go that way rather than going to sea, because going to sea is no good for a marriage, and the times are too long away and not conducive to a good marriage. That's how I got changed around from going to sea. I think I would have enjoyed it, and just sort of a lonesome life that I could think of. And in those days, if you signed on the ship, they wanted you signed on for a year or a year and a half. And if your ship happened to be going foreign, like to Tokyo or things like that, why, well, I remember the American President line, it would take 4 months for you to go around the world and visit all the ports. So you only made 3 trips a year, but for the whole year you might not be home, or briefly home at the best. While I was going to college, my mom went to Berkeley Secretarial School in East Orange, and so she was doing that, and then she got a job with a law firm in Newark, and I went to work for Mr. Dietz in the agency department, and I would go down to the ships and take the payrolls down to the captain, and in the office, why, I would get orders to when the ships were coming in, and I'd have to contact my marine operators to tell the captain where the tug was going to meet him and when and so forth. It was a very interesting job, but not a high-paying job. The price was $20 a week.